Hi, my name is Peter Bonfido. I'm the director of the art galleries here at ACC. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's event. So tonight's event, Representing Women in the Art Museum by Lana Meador. This is a project that we initiated because we've got to know Lana a little bit through the Texas Sculpture Group exhibition. And so Lana was partnered with us and juried that exhibition. We had many artworks and she helped select those. And on a personal note, I'd just like to thank her for her professionalism. And it was a real joy working with her on that project. This is also a really great way for us to kick off Women's History Month, looking at this talk and thinking about also the women represented in the Texas Sculpture Group exhibition. And before we start, I'd also like to thank TAG and ADM staff for putting this event together. I'd also like to thank our TLED group for their technical assistance, and I'd like to thank the audience for coming in person and those of you on Zoom. Lana Meador is Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the San Antonio Museum of Art, where she has been part of the curatorial team since 2015. She received her BA in English from UT Austin and her MA in Art History from Texas Christian University. At the San Antonio Museum of Art, she has worked on many exhibitions, including Of Country and Culture, the Lamb Collection of Contemporary Australian Aboriginal Art in 2017. In 2023, she organized a site-specific mural by Carlos Rosella Silva that launched the Gateway Project series. With Suzanne Weaver, she co-curated the exhibition and co-wrote the catalog, Texas Women, A New History of Abstract Art, in 2020, which is one of the topics of tonight's talk. This evening, Lana will share insights in women's history in the art museum, both through narratives of display and representation of women artists in collections and exhibitions. Please join me in welcoming Lana.
Hello, thank you so much for being here, both in person and online. And thank you to Peter for the invitation to speak to you guys tonight, and also to the Texas Sculpture Group for inviting me to jury the exhibition and introducing me to all the wonderful people here at ACC and the artists that are in the show. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you a little bit about some projects I've worked on at the museum, all focusing on the representation of women in the arts. So I'll give you just a brief background in case you're not familiar with SAMA about the museum and its history. So here's a picture you see here, beautiful shot of our building from the river. We're positioned on the San Antonio River in the heart, basically on the north side of downtown San Antonio. As far as art museums go, we're relatively young. We opened in 1981, and we're in a very unique building. We're the only accredited art museum that's in a former brewery. And so it's a wonderful example of adaptive reuse and an early example in the United States of that. We opened in 1981, and we have now over 13.5-acre campus. Here you see a old picture of the brewery past and some of the historic spaces. We now have over 30,000 objects representing 5,000 years of human history. This is just a small sampling of the collections that you might see. We have real strengths in ancient Mediterranean art. So the picture you see on the upper left, that's in one of the historic brewery spaces where they had the huge vats for making the beer. And so it's this like incredible kind of cathedral-like space. And of course, we've had some new additions too, like our Asian art wing was added on in the early 2000s, and we have an incredible collection of Asian art across cultures, but particularly Chinese ceramics. We also have a fantastic Latin American art wing that is a newer addition as well, with works of art from pre-colonial period all the way to contemporary. So I invite you to come visit us if you can, make your way down to San Antonio. There's lots to see. And it's really an incredible place as a contemporary art curator to talk about contemporary art in the context of this great global history. And with that is also an incredible responsibility to shape the collection and our exhibition program and to say whose stories are going to be told. And so museums are really in this position of authority. Hopefully many of you are familiar with Linda Nochlund's incredible essay, this watershed essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? This was written in 1971. And of course, I remember reading it going over in grad school, and I went back over it again to prepare for this talk, and so much of it still resonates today, unfortunately. But in the essay, Linda Nochlund talks about the importance of institutional and educational support for creative growth. And this is why, women artists over the centuries have had these kind of blockades to gaining access to those aspects of institutional and educational opportunities. There's lots of exclusion and social inequalities that have made it difficult for women to achieve this idea of greatness. And the fact that this idea of greatness is really kind of a masculine conceit as well. And so the museums are part of this institutional and educational network that has played a role in this exclusion of many groups over the centuries. And it's a position of authority that helps kind of form the canon of whose work is being preserved for the future generations, whose stories are being told, what artists are being kind of put out there into the public sphere, that their names are getting known because they're having major exhibitions at museums or being included in publications that museums are coming out. They're asking scholars to do research on these artists, really establishing the historical narrative of art. So I've included a couple stats. These are from the National Museum of Women in the Arts about museums and their role of representing women. And this is still very, very dire. There's been a lot of progress made, of course, and we see a lot more women artists being honored and shown with retrospective exhibitions, but we're still seeing that only 11% of all acquisitions in the past decade are by women artists. That's a really uphill battle with collections that are already stacked with largely male artists. And then only 14% of exhibitions at museums that were surveyed in the past decade are prominently featuring women artists. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And I want to share with you two projects that I've worked on at the museum that hopefully are kind of pushing the needle in the right direction. The first is the exhibition Peter mentioned, Texas Women, A New History of Abstract Art. And this occurred in 2020. So if you didn't see it, I don't blame you. Unfortunately, it was the worst year to open a women-centered exhibition and get it really widely seen. But we do have a publication. This is the book cover here. So hopefully it'll continue to live on and inspire. But I want to acknowledge my co-curator on this project because it really, it's kind of her brainchild, Suzanne Weaver, who is my mentor and was a former curator at SAMA with me. And it was just a real honor to work with her on this and co-author the catalog. So much acknowledgement to Suzanne for this project. The curatorial vision and concept was to create this kind of new narrative of the strength and innovation of abstract artists, women artists in Texas. And I'll just kind of go through some gallery shots while I talk about it. But we really wanted to share, that women were some of the first artists innovating with formal abstract concerns in the state, and how this continues to be a vital mode of art making that many living artists are still kind of pushing the boundaries with today. And so we start with kind of the two historical anchors of the show, which you see in this slide, with the large-scale painting by Dorothy Hood on the left, and then the smaller oil pastel, just gorgeous drawings by Tony Lascelles. Those were the only two deceased artists in the show that kind of formed the historical base, and then the rest of the exhibition was artists who continue or living and working in Texas today, like Terrell James, you see here in the foreground. So we wanted to acknowledge, too, that labeling a show Texas Women was somewhat problematic. Some people don't want to be labeled or confined to, region or gender, but we still felt it was important to put that new narrative forward. And of course, it's not comprehensive by any means. It'd be nearly impossible to do a survey that completely, shared the entirety of abstract artists working in the state. But we opted instead to focus on a core group of, there were 17 artists, and to be able to show multiple examples of their work. So you see here 2 paintings in this gorgeous wall sculpture by the artist Catherine Lee, or this grouping of works by Liz Trosper. So we started thinking of it as kind of a conversation starter. We're going to put forward this kind of new history, and it still continues to be written. And there's many other, we were hoping, exhibitions that could come out of this. This wasn't the definitive or final word on the subject by any frame of the imagination. And we also, wanted to talk about the different ways in which people are approaching abstraction, but also maybe kind of crossing those boundaries. And so the exhibition was divided into these kind of broad approaches of gestural and improvisational systems and structures, which you see, examples here with Susie Rosemarin's really meticulous, repetitive compositions, and then collage. You might be able to kind of see at the end of this gallery, there is a separate room that you walk into and you see these reflections coming up onto the walls. And this was an incredible site-specific installation by Margot Sawyer, who I think really crosses the boundaries of all of those kind of categories I just named. She created this work in the space, really intuitively, organically, kind of responding to the space with all the materials at hand. So it's kind of improvisational in a lot of ways there. But there's also this underlying system and structure that she's working with too. And the diversity of materials, it's also a collage. So we kind of set these categories, but then wanted to kind of transgress them as well with the artists that we chose. So I'll just kind of dive into that kind of historical underpinning a bit and talk about one artist in particular. But I'm starting here with Julian Onderdonk from the Sama collection, and then another example, a contemporaneous work by Georgia O'Keeffe, who spent some time in Texas. These are both from around 1917. And at the time, Onderdonk's quite popular. And, this is kind of what Texas art is known for, these bluebonnet paintings. And for a lot of people, this is still very much what they think about when they think about Texas artists. I found it really interesting that in the 70s, when the museum, San Antonio Museum of Art, was building the collection to open the art museum, we acquired 5 paintings by Onderdonk in the 70s and 80s. But we did not acquire a Georgia O'Keeffe, who was also working in the state at the same time, responding to the landscape, the vastness of the Texas skies in a very different way, innovating with her just incredible watercolors. So she was, one of the first probably artists working abstractly here. These are, the two kind of historical anchors that were included in the Texas Women Show, and it was really kind of grew out of people that were in our collection, Dorothy Hood on the left, and then Toni Lascelles on the right. So I mentioned that we had acquired some Onderdonk paintings in the 70s and 80s at the museum, and we also got Dorothy Hood at the time, so that was a really, good step forward. We eventually got another work by Toni Lascelles, but it was not until 2017, so it was many, many decades later that we're building the Texas art collection and starting to look back at, who have we missed. So I'm very proud that both of these are in our collection today and inspired the beginnings of the Texas Women exhibition. Toni Lascelles was born in Beatrice, Nebraska, and attended the University of Chicago. And there she really became influenced by a professor who had seen the 1913 Armory show. Toni Lascelles was born in 1901. And so she herself wasn't able to go attend the Armory show, but learned about it in college. And learning about abstraction, about the avant-garde, really changed the course of her art making and her life. She said, from that time on, I began to realize that to do representational work really stood for a time and a thinking that really wasn't in accord with the time in which I was living. So there's this idea of responding to contemporary experience that I think starts with Toni Lascelles and still is very vital and vibrant with artists working today in abstraction. So by 1928, she moves to Denton, Texas, and spends, the rest of her life here in North Texas. She's teaching art and design at the Texas State College for Women, which is now known as Texas Women's University. And so she's teaching all women students. And by 1930s, she's really completely committed to non-objectivity or abstraction in her practice. She begins in the 40s, spending summers in Provincetown, Massachusetts, as many artists from the Northeast did as well. And we're learning from Hans Hofmann. The picture here, she appears to be on the beach in Provincetown, which is endless kind of inspiration for her practice. And I just love this painting that was included in the show, Climate of the Heart, number 7, because it so beautifully represents how she approached abstraction, really eliminating any sort of horizon line or figure ground relationships. They create kind of their own, world and reality through color, through form, through movement. You might see, a lot of blues and kind of beiges and grays here that might possibly evoke that of a beach, looking out on the water into the sky. It evokes that feeling, but yet it's abstract. And she really creates this kind of balance or equilibrium through her compositions. And I think that even more so to me, when I look at this, kind of evokes the feeling of being kind of on the beach and at peace and one with nature. So while she was at Texas Women's University, she was really influential to generations of women students and artists, teaching there for 44 years. Over 4,000 students came through her classrooms. So she's really kind of this catalyst for generations of women and for these kind of new ideas about abstraction. This is a project she worked on there, Little Chapel in the Woods, which was designed by O'Neill Ford. And Toni Lascelles was supervising the students that were doing the stained glass windows for the chapel. And so this was kind of like a Bauhaus approach to art and design, really integrating the applied arts, technology. The students were working on the light fixtures, the pews, the stained glass. And so this sparked a conversation then with the new Bauhaus in Chicago and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who was heading that institution at the time, who had immigrated from Europe, fleeing the war, and bringing these ideas over to the United States. And so Toni Lascelles invited him to come speak at Texas Women's University. And on several occasions, he came, I think around 3 times in the 1940s. It was through that he also came in contact with other professors and artists there, like Carlota Corcoran and Ida Lansky, who were really experimenting with photography, exploring different ways to achieve effects of light and form with different materials and photographic processes, kind of a scientific almost approach to the medium. And so, Toni Lascelles kind of sets off all of this innovation and new thought that's happening. So she was a perfect kind of anchor to the show to really talk about the kind of burgeoning ideas here in the state of Texas. And what's exciting about the exhibition, we got to share some of these works with our community and record them in prosperity, in the catalog. We were also able to acquire a few of the artists for our permanent collection, so that we can, continue to engage with them and show their work in different contexts. So one of the works was by Marcelin McNeil, this incredible ramp painting that was included in the show. And with her, you can see she's definitely kind of carrying on that legacy of, say, Helen Frankenthaler, with pouring the paint and staining the unprimed canvas and experimenting with different ways, the manners that the paint might react. She's also responding to architecture. I mean, this is a ramp. It's a piece of sculpture as much as it is a painting. It's in our space. It's responding to the gallery that it's in. And I think she really reminds me of Lascelles in some ways as I was looking at this piece again, thinking about this presentation, in this kind of rhythm that she achieves in the way she lays the paint down, alternating between what might be fast or slow. You can kind of feel the way that maybe the paint slowly bled, or it gives you a more kind of rushing feeling down the plane, and achieves that kind of equilibrium, I think, that Lascelles achieved as well. This piece by Liz Trosper also entered our collection after the exhibition. It's large scale and almost hard to explain if you haven't seen it in person. It's a painting, but it's also kind of a photograph. I mean, she's creating these with scanners. She is taking skeins of paint and different pieces of paper and collaging materials from her studio and putting them on a flatbed scanner and encouraging these different kind of glitches within that scan to create these really large scale abstract paintings. And so in that, she's kind of interrogating these genres of painting, of photography, of collage, every kind of genre you can think of. And also it kind of interrogating this abstract gesture, that we so often associate with abstract expressionism and Jackson Pollock, of these kind of skeins of paint that go across the surface of the canvas. So she really kind of complicates those ideas here. And then Liz Ward is another artist who's based in San Antonio that we were able to acquire after the Texas Women exhibition. And actually, her piece we acquired as part of an initiative to acquire San Antonio artists during the year 2020. And through that, we were able to do a video series with Wally Films, another San Antonio-based artist duo. And I'll share just a clip in a moment. But you'll see that this piece, Ghost of the Old Mississippi, Dismal Swamp, Northern Lights, is from this larger series that she did that documents the changing courses of the Mississippi River. And so this one really borders on kind of representation and abstraction. You see this kind of beautiful skeins of paint that are going kind of diagonal throughout the composition. And those are these courses of the river that were based on geological surveys. So they're really documenting something real in our landscape, but they take on this kind of color field or abstract expressionist quality in her work. And she's also collaged on other, wallpapers and photographic imagery of the landscape, and really talking about this like layered environmental and social history that deals with that area. The river being obviously this natural source, but how it's been manipulated through human intervention, through damming, how it's been used for commerce and trade, including things such as the slave trade, and how this really creates a very complicated and complex relationship that we have with places and spaces that we move through. You can watch the rest of the video of Liz, and we have another suite of artists that we acquired through this initiative that we did videos with as well. And it really, I think, shares a lot of insights into their practice, but also their process and materials. And those are found on our website. And so I liked that, we were able to acquire work by artists and show them in our galleries, but then also create this other complementary aspect that further research into their practices and that's accessible to people through our website. And I think, particularly when we're talking about women artists and the different ways that we can layer that representation and make it more accessible to the public is just fantastic. And I also mentioned, I think, that Suzanne and I understood this wasn't going to be kind of a comprehensive survey, but that we hoped it would be a conversation starter. And so to our, great delight, it was. And there was 2 exhibitions actually that took place in 2022 that were kind of inspired by our show, that were building on that group of artists that we worked with, but also adding to that. These took place at the Art Museum of South Texas in Corpus Christi. You can see we loaned our fantastic Liz Trosper painting to the show. And then also at the Art Museum of Southeast Texas, who did a particular iteration that focused on artists within a 200-mile radius of Beaumont. So I hope, it'll continue to spark conversations and projects throughout the state and beyond the state that speak to the innovative and incredible qualities of women artists. The second project I wanted to mention tonight is kind of looking at the representation of women in a different way. This is a male artist, but he's looking at reframing the art historical narrative of how women have been depicted throughout art history, and particularly focusing on imagery of goddesses, which often comes through as a Venus form that's associated with femininity, with beauty, with love. The exhibition, it's a small focus show that's on view currently at the museum in what we call the Steves Gallery, and it's positioned exactly in between our American art galleries and our Latin American Art Center. So it's quite literally this intersection of the Americas, and this is kind of the first project that we're doing to explore that, to show Latin American artists in context of other objects in our collection, to kind of talk about those different intersections and ideas and materials and process, and also create kind of an expanded view of what Latin American art could be. So this is a Latino artist, a Latinx artist who grew up in Puerto Rico, then studied art in New York, and then eventually moved to San Antonio and lived there for many decades. His name is Angel Rodriguez Diaz. Here he was in his studio. He just passed away last year, and the Focus exhibition celebrates this acquisition we did of one of the paintings in the triptych. So what you see here is his goddess triptych. We had the two paintings on the left and the right in the collection since 2013. They were gifts to us by the renowned author Sandra Cisneros. But we did not have the central panel. So it was actually in Angel's private collection. And luckily we were able to acquire it from him last year before he passed. And so this, we wanted to mark the occasion of reuniting the goddesses, but also put them within the context of our global collections. So Angel, here he is in his studio. He's known for his distinct approach to portraiture, drawing on his own experience as a gay Latino man of African, Taino, and Spanish descent. He approaches portraiture with these many different layers of exploring identity, of power. He's deeply engaged in his work with art history, as hopefully you can see here, reframing often art historical precedents with women of color or people of color, as you see in this triptych. And he's really studying the masters like Velázquez, El Greco, Goya, and Rubens. And so in this series, he's obviously looking at artists like Botticelli and their depiction of the Venus, of Aphrodite, and looking at antiquity, the Capitoline Venus that I've shared here, this kind of famous Venus Pudica pose that becomes a type then of this modest Venus, covering her torso with her arms. And this, starts all the way in ancient Rome and Greece, and then is carried through in the Renaissance in works like The Birth of Venus. And it really becomes this kind of type then that is perpetuated of the goddess of love and beauty being this very, slender, fair-skinned, beautiful young woman. And how these are made then, for the gaze, like for the male gaze, by a male artist, certainly. So in this painting, it's called The Myth of Venus. The subject that Angel has is a friend of his who posed. And I think you can tell in all three of his portraits that he has a relationship with his subject, that they're very they carry forward the individual in a really incredible way. In addition to kind of looking back at the examples I shared previous slide, he's very much also looking at Baroque artists and Peter Paul Rubens and their approach to form, still using this very typical Venus Pudica pose in the little fur, but approaching the body in a much more realistic manner. And he's even looking to prehistoric models. Here are three examples. So you might be familiar with the iconic Venus of Willendorf that's in the upper left. Of course, this is very renowned for kind of the voluptuousness of the figure, the approach to the female form in this way. At Sama, we have the form that's on the bottom. And this is a halaf figure that's from present day Syria that dates to the 6,000 to 5,000 BC. So we didn't have something quite as old as the Venus of Willendorf, but we did have something that was quite ancient and really beautifully mirrored the portrait's pose with the way her arms are grasping her breasts. And then the other female figure you see here is a Cycladic figurine that's from the Cyclades Islands. And this has, become a very inspiring form throughout modernist art history for a kind of simplification of the female form, almost to abstraction. And she also here is posed with her arms crossing her abdomen. So I think Angel is looking at all of these things when he's thinking about representing the Venus. Often these prehistoric figures are looked at as, fertility goddesses or some sort of a goddess figurine, even though, archaeological context may not exactly confirm that. But I think the fact that we kind of look back and impose that idea of a goddess on the female form from other cultures really says a lot about our approach to looking at women in art, and can start a conversation about identity and the body. In this painting, Angel has titled it La Primavera, so very much responding to the Sandro Botticelli Primavera from the 15th century, and evoking that in the floral details that he's including here. But Sandra Payne, that's the name of the woman he's depicted here. She's an artist and a librarian. She's smiling. She's giving off an incredible amount of warmth, of personality, of individuality. And I think it stands, in such stark contrast to the kind of expressionlessness of the women included in the Botticelli, that you really see that they all are kind of this type that we're looking at, that ancient precedent of the Venus pudica. That's this really elongated, slender body, very pale-skinned, very expressionless in a lot of ways. And so Angel's really stands in stark contrast. And the third painting in the triptych is the one that we were recently able to acquire, Yemaya. And she's certainly, they're all incredible, but she is the most, I think, kind of exuberant and powerful of the three. She's the central panel, and it really was important to me to make sure that we reunited them to preserve the artist's vision, for future generations. And here she is, Yemaya, who's named after the Yoruba mother goddess, the goddess of oceans. And this is a tradition that was brought from Africa to the Caribbean through the slave trade. And this woman, Diana Fraser, has an incredible, powerful stance with her arms outstretched. As I said, she's exuding confidence, in contrast, I think, to the more modest poses of the other two Venuses. And luckily, we had in the collection a statuette of Aphrodite from ancient Rome that just perfectly paired with this portrait. You can see her arms, they're echoing the same kind of, it's almost like a proposition that they're giving you of their arms in that same pose, not shielding their body, but presenting it to the viewer, but in very kind of different ways, right? You might be able to tell, it's kind of hard to notice in this slide, but there's also this amazing quality of light in Angel's portrait, where there's almost these rays of light that are emanating from Diana's head, and these kind of then mirror the crown that our statuette of Aphrodite is wearing as well. So she's quite regal. This quality of light also connects to another aspect of art history, which is represented in the SAMA collection, and that's of American landscape painting. Angel was also, looking beyond portraits, beyond the female form, and was very much inspired by landscape painting as well. You might have noticed, several of these paintings include these really dramatic skies and seascapes, incredible landscape paintings with the figures included. And we see, in our Bierstadt, this interest in the sublime through this incredible quality of light in Passing Storm over the Sierra Nevadas. But in Bierstadt's landscape, it's completely unpopulated. We don't have any sign of of humanity. There's no sign of maybe the indigenous peoples that have populated this area for centuries, of any sort of violent struggle that may have occurred, or people who have toiled on the landscape. And Angel really counters that. He puts the figure here at the forefront. And she really almost appears to personify or embody the power of nature itself. So along with Angel's triptych and some of the ancient artworks that I shared with you from our collection, we were also able to get a loan from Art Bridges to include this incredible video. These are just a couple of film stills by the Cuban-born artist Ana Mendieta. Mendieta, born in Cuba, was a refugee and immigrated to the United States as a young girl, and then through her work, very much explored that experience, a loss of her homeland, reuniting kind of the female form with the landscape. And this video, Esculturas Rupestres, was actually on the occasion of our first visit back to Cuba after she had fled. So in 1981, she went back and filmed these different forms in the landscape. She herself carved them and placed them in the landscape in the caves at Jaruco Park. But they're based off Taino goddess figures that are indigenous to that area. So there's this kind of conflation of time and space of, placing a figure in the landscape that's it's contemporary, but it's hearkening back to the past. It's stating a claim to something that was always there and always will be there. They're ephemeral in many ways. It was an action. It was a performance that she did in the landscape. And, they've faded over time. So they're living on in this particular video that's been recently conserved. So we'll have this video as part of the installation through June of this year. So if you can get down to see us before June 30th, you'll capture this wonderful Mendieta film. We're also doing an incredible amount of programming for this very small but powerful focus show. We, through the support of Art Bridges, were able to partner with the Guadalupe Dance Company and the Carver Community Cultural Center, who have been incredible to work with and inspired by the themes in the exhibition of women's empowerment, of relationships with the landscape. And so we have three, they'll be doing readings as well as a commissioned dance piece, and we'll have three opportunities to engage in different ways with those artworks and that artistic process. These are just in-person events. They won't be streamed. So hopefully we can see you in person in San Antonio. And finally, I just wanted to end my talk with what's up next. The stats that I showed at the beginning talked about this, very uphill battle that we're facing with representation of women in art museums through collections, through exhibitions. And so for me, I'm always thinking about that in ways to move forward with impactful projects that we might never be able to create equity, especially with large scale collections like the museum, over 30,000 objects. But how can we support very impactful projects that change the conversation? And so we're hosting two exhibitions that are upcoming within the next year that were organized by other institutions. One of them is Amalia Mesa Bain's Archaeology of Memory, that was organized by the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. That is the work of the pioneering Chicana artist, Amalia Mesa Bains, who for decades has innovated on sacred forms like altares and ofrendas to often speak about issues of womanhood and retell historical narratives of both her ancestors and kind of mythic, heroic, and real women throughout history. And she does an incredible way of kind of exploring that across cultures, across time periods, across geographies. And then the second project is organized by the Birmingham Museum of Art. And this features the photography of Manjari Sharma, a contemporary photographer who re-envisions Hindu deities in her large-scale photographs. And these are, not manipulated digitally in any way, but they're just meticulously crafted and staged large-scale images. And those will be paired with some historical works from the Birmingham collection that explore these themes of sacred in Hindu art. So lots to see, and we're just supporting women artists at SAMA and have them on view in our collection as well in our galleries. And so I invite you to come visit us and give me a call when you come in town. I'll be happy to walk through the galleries with you.
Thank you so much. That was a really great talk. We have time to take some questions.
Sure, yeah, happy to.
We have a question right here.
It's such an interesting question, the number of art pieces by men and women and that whole calculation that, but
yeah.
You have a lot of antiquities and we don't know for sure who made those. And then I know that there is also like a prejudice thinking, oh, these are all sculptors because we're so used. Where were the women artists? They never existed. But if you look carefully, there might have been a whole bunch of those art pieces that were done by women. And I know they discovered not too long ago, or they looked carefully that a lot of the hands, the negative hands on walls in cave art in Europe, they discovered that they were made by women just as much as men. So suddenly it turns the idea that all these artists that left these very ancient things were men. I think of the Venuses, the goddesses, the ancient goddesses could have totally been carved by women. There is no reason they wouldn't have been.
Absolutely.
So that offsets your balance in maybe gender neutral art pieces.
Yeah, no, that's a complicated question with, collections that are largely, we have not yet identified the artist, right? And we may never be able to. Yeah, so when I saw those statistics, I was thinking oh, how do we stack up? But how do I figure that out?
All the ancient art, you don't know for sure unless you
right.
know a particular Greek sculptor who was known and we know his name.
Exactly. I think, what's interesting about that you mentioned is, the assumption that they're all male artists. Part of the work of trying to rewrite the narrative and reframe the history of assuming that anything that was worth, preserving in our times was done by a male artist. No, that's a really good point.
I'm going to ask you a couple questions we got from Zoom. I have many of my own questions.
Oh, good.
I want to take these as well. So how did your work with the Texas Women jump this line there. How did your work with the Texas Women exhibition shape your approach to the Texas Sculpture Group Show?
Oh, yeah, that's a good, well, I mean, I did not grow up in Texas. So I've been here for some time, been learning about Texas history and Texas artists, and especially with the SAMA collection, learning a lot more about the history of Texas art prior to contemporary periods. And so I think, it gave me the opportunity to kind of, the essay I wrote, kind of focused on those historical underpinnings of, Toni LaSalle and Dorothy Hood and kind of what came before them and how they were such a seismic shift. And so working on the Texas Women Project allowed me to kind of, get up to speed a bit more on Texas art history. But also just, the way of how we kind of regionalize things and thinking about Texas artists and what's that relationship between the local and the global. And that's something I think about a lot in my work at the museum. We're a global art museum, encyclopedic art museum, as they're termed. And, the contemporary collection should reflect that as well. But at the same time, that doesn't preclude us from exploring regional or local art and artists. I mean, we're all part of that conversation. we are part of a global history, and the things that are happening in the state of Texas are often quite looked at by national and international audiences, and we have a real voice and a story to tell. So I think that was maybe part of it, and coming to the Texas Sculpture Group exhibition, and yeah, it's just an incredible diverse array of approaches to art making and materials and ideas that the artists were exploring. So
That's great. I think part of your talk, especially in the first part of the talk, when you're thinking about what I kept thinking about is how you're kind of introducing, or you're reintroducing, or you're in some ways entering into this larger dialogue a lot of these artworks. And that's one of the things a museum can do. Artists create the work, but then after it leaves their hands, then the museum can at any time after that point kind of re-examine it and talk about it. And the way that you were talking about the not just creating the book and putting it on the shelf, right? You're thinking about other exhibitions which have happened. And so it's an expansive view. It's like, and it also questions like, who are Texas artists? And it's more of an expansive view, which I think is a little bit more more fun and interesting and constructive. So it's great. I really enjoyed the talk. Are there other questions from the audience?
Thinking about those stats, I know with galleries, there's a lot of new galleries opening that are showing all women, or they're bragging about showing more than 70% women. And I was curious if there are any new museums opening that are looking to show all women artists.
That's a good question. Well, I mean, there's the National Museum of Women in the Arts, where I got those statistics from. So that is definitely dedicated to all women. Gosh, I don't know off the top of my head if there's another institution like that. And women in their work, yes, that's featuring all women artists all the time, just here in Austin. That's a good one. But yeah, largely museums have not been singularly focused on a gender. And so, yeah, it makes it challenging. I'll have to do some research to see if there's any others around. Great question.
The questions from the audience? Another one I have is how much there's also the very iconic Guerrilla Girls artwork, and has that also informed any of your decisions or something to reflect on?
Oh yeah, they're incredible. The Guerrilla Girls came to San Antonio actually and did a presentation at the McNay Art Museum a few years ago, and I was just starstruck to be in the same room as artists who have made such an incredible impact on the art world, and particularly with the representation of women artists. So yeah, I mean, that's part of that conversation with Linda Nochlin and the Guerrilla Girls, those kind of foundational feminist art historians and critiques that were allowed and said, you've got to pay attention to this. As I said in the beginning, we've made a lot of progress, but obviously there's still a lot more work to be done. I was a little surprised by those statistics, but I guess not, So yeah, I will say that I think, the work at the San Antonio Museum of Art, I was trying to see, how we shake up to those stats. And in recent years, our exhibition program certainly has been above and beyond that, whatever it was, 16% or 11%. We've had major exhibitions by Wendy Red Star. We're upcoming, we'll have a Molly Mesa Baines. We have the Texas Women Show. When it comes to collecting though, it's a lot, you get large gifts sometimes, and it's based on what the collectors have chosen over the years, over the decades. And they certainly reflect those historic trends that, institutions, galleries, scholarship was focusing on male artists. So there's certainly more, work we can be done to achieve equity, but we have, I like to use the exhibition program as kind of a pathway to acquire works of art for the museum. So the more that we're able to support artists and interpret their work through our exhibition program, the more we can then hopefully acquire pieces by those artists and add to our collection. And so that's a good way to do it, to support women artists and artists of color through our exhibition program. And then hopefully that leads to an acquisition.
I have another question here that we got from Zoom. This is a personal question. As a curator, how do you battle through projects like Texas Women? Does it ever feel defeating, realizing how similar our times are to the past?
Yeah, I mean, it is, yes, it can be defeating sometimes, but working on that project, it was exciting through and through from the beginning to the end. And so you feel really invigorated by the work that you're doing, having conversations with artists in their studios, thinking about their work in, a larger context, working on writing about it for the catalog. Like, there's nothing defeating about that. It's the best part. And then that exhibition opening, I remember, was just the most exciting exhibition opening I've been to. I mean, all of the artists came, their dealers came, friends and family came, and it was, just a really incredible energy. You could tell, that people were very excited to be there. They were engaged with the artwork. They were talking to the artists and learning more about their practices directly from the artists. I mean, it was a really happy and exciting time. And it was February of 2020. So we didn't even know, how exciting that really was to be in this room full of artistic talent from across the state. So nothing defeating about Texas Women. It was exciting.
We have another question from Zoom. Are there any upcoming women artists who you're excited about? Are there any specifically in Texas?
Oh, that's a hard question because there are so many. I mean, there's so many all the time. I'm very excited to be working on the Amalia Mesa Baines exhibition. She's not a Texas artist, but is a Chicana artist who I think will resonate a lot with our community and with many artists here in the state as well that are maybe responding to similar ideas and use of materials. So I'm very excited to present that at the museum and kind of think through how her work engages with our global collections. I mean, there's too many artists to name just one that are exciting in Texas. I'm continually inspired and engaged, and I love finding out about artists that are new to me. They're not new at all. They've been making work in their studios and other people are aware of them. But when I am, able to discover for myself an artist I didn't know about, that's, the most exciting part of my day and doing studio visits. Always love that.
Well, any last questions?
I was going to say that in listening to you today and being a female curator in a fairly large institution, and I'd love to know, in 30 years, your take on, do you see, and as you've worked over time, the difference in who's in charge, how many curators, men to women, or diversity in that, and also people that are directors, or people that are fundraisers. And do you, in the time that you've been in museums, do you see a shift, or, and then come back in 30 years and see if there's any shift at all? I was noticing when you had the book, you showed the front of the book, it said 50-year anniversary.
I know. There was a publication, and there in that particular edition, there's a kind of postscript that Linda Nochlin wrote, reflecting on it. And it's quite interesting as well, for her to, kind of talk about how some things have changed, but how some things haven't. So if you can get your hands on that edition, I think it's the most recent one. It has a nice postscript. That's a lot of food for thought. But back to your question about women, in the art museum, as far as curatorial director, administrative roles, I thought about that, and I didn't put it in the talk because it was like getting very long. But that's definitely part of it too. And those are the people who are kind of choosing what exhibitions and programs are happening, what acquisitions, and leading the conversation with boards and potential funding sources. And I will say that at San Antonio Museum of Art, my experience has been, we've been led by women the whole time I've worked there. There's been always women in our senior leadership roles, and women strongly represented in the curatorial department. So that's been great and very inspiring. I've had a lot of wonderful women mentors to learn from. I don't think that's necessarily the same nationally. I think, there's been, major institutions that have hired their first women director, like the National Gallery of Art and Kaywin Feldman, and Thelma Golden leading the Studio Museum. There's major museums and institutions that are run by women, but it's not the norm necessarily. I think the statistic, I don't know it off the top of my head, but that is pretty low. So there's still change that can happen there. Because I think, largely coming out of academic programs, you see mostly women who are studying now to get their PhDs and museum studies programs and looking for curatorial positions. So I think surely the tides will change in 30 years.
Well, let's all again thank Lana for her great talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.